Everyone has an opinion about Nick Diaz, the bad boy. The gangster. The guy who flips off crowds, misses press conferences, and tests positive for weed while the whole world watches. But here's the thing. Almost everything you think you know about Nick Diaz is wrong. And by the time this is over, you're not going to see him the same way again. Because the real story of Nick Diaz isn't about controversy. It's about a kid who never wanted to fight, who came from nothing, who carried his entire family on his back, who got chewed up and spat out by a sport that never deserved him in the first place. This is the story they never told you. Stockton, California is not a place that goes easy on you. It's a city where gang violence isn't something you hear about, something you navigate around every single day just to get to school. And for Nick Diaz, growing up there was less of a childhood and more of a survival course. His mom was a waitress working 8-hour shifts for 30 years straight. His dad wasn't around. 3 kids, a 2-bedroom house. And a shitty car she'd drop Nick off down the street from school in because he was too embarrassed to be seen getting out of it. That's where Nick Diaz came from. And if that wasn't enough to deal with, Nick was quietly battling something nobody around him had the tools to identify. He had a DD and severe anxiety. In a well-funded school with proper resources, that's manageable. In a poor Stockton school surrounded by gang recruitment and daily fights, it was a death sentence for any kind of normal future. He couldn't focus in class. He pulled fire alarms he didn't mean to pull. He got escorted from class to class on a half-day program because the school decided he was dangerous, all while being a genuinely insecure kid who just wanted to fit in and couldn't figure out why everything felt so hard. The gangs noticed him. Of course, they did. He had a reputation for being tough, and that's exactly the kind of kid they go after. But something kept Nick from going down that road. Not a program. Not a counselor. Not a mentor from the community. Just a faint signal of something that actually made sense to him: jiu-jitsu. He dropped out sophomore year and started training. And the moment he walked into that gym, something clicked that had never clicked anywhere else in his life. He wasn't behind. He wasn't a problem. He was dangerous in the best possible way, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He dominated almost immediately. U.S. Open Jiu-Jitsu champion. Grappler's Quest winner. And before most fighters his age had even had their first professional bout, Nick Diaz was winning MMA tournaments and catching the attention of people who knew what elite looked like. At just 18 years old, in only his second professional fight, he defeated MMA veteran Chris Liddell to capture the IFC welterweight title. The guy he beat had been around long enough that he didn't even know who Nick was walking in. By the time it was over, he was telling people he almost quit the sport on the spot from the embarrassment of losing to a teenager. But before we go any further into what Nick built in that cage, you have to understand what he was really fighting for, because it was never about him. Nate Diaz was getting pulled into the same streets that tried to swallow Nick. Gang fights, stabbings, the whole ecosystem of violence that Stockton specialized in. And Nick, who had barely found his own footing, reached back and grabbed his little brother, brought him to the gym, made him train. And Nate, to his credit, never left. From that day forward, everything Nick did in that cage carried a second purpose. Win for himself, yes, but more than that, show his brother what was possible. Show him that there was a path out. Nick became Nate's MMA coach, his life coach, his compass. Nate has said openly that without Nick, he'd have been in serious trouble. And he meant it. So when Nick stepped into the octagon, he wasn't just fighting for a paycheck. He was fighting to prove something to a brother who was watching, to a mother who worked herself to the bone. And to every person in Stockton who told him he didn't belong anywhere that mattered, his earliest run was electric and chaotic in equal measure. The knockout of Robbie Lawler alone should have turned the entire sport on its head. Nobody, not the media, not the fans, not Lawler himself, saw it coming. Lawler was a dark destroyer at that point, flatlining opponents with alarming regularity. Nick walked in, started talking his particular brand of Stockton trash, and knocked him clean out. The only people who weren't shocked were the ones who had been paying attention from the beginning. But Nick's UFC run hit the same wall that would follow him his entire career decisions. He was a finisher who fought for damage, for submissions, for the ending. He wasn't fighting for rounds. He wasn't thinking about scorecards. And judges, reliably and maddeningly, punished him for it. He lost decisions he believed he won. He won fights that looked like losses on paper. And every time it happened, it created a little more distance between Nick Diaz and the sport he was already struggling to love. Then there was the hospital brawl. After a loss to Joe Riggs, both men ended up in the same emergency room, getting patched up. And somehow, because this is Nick Diaz we're talking about, it didn't end there. Riggs started talking. Nick heard it. And what happened next ended with both of them getting stitched up twice in the same night for free. The cops who broke it up wanted his autograph. The UFC was considerably less charmed. They eventually parted ways, but not before Nick stacked a few more wins, including a convincing run that put him on the radar of Pride FC, taking on Takanori Gomi in Pride. At lightweight, against the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world at 155, was the kind of move that defined Nick's entire approach to the sport. He didn't ask if it made sense. He didn't calculate the risk. He just wanted the best fight he could get, and Gomi was it. And then Nick went out and submitted him with a gogo plata, one of the rarest, most difficult submissions in all of MMA, after eating a shot that cut him open. The fight was later overturned to a no contest because Nick tested positive for marijuana. His response was essentially that he didn't know it was against the rules, which, knowing Nick, was probably true. This is where you have to understand something about Nick Diaz and weed that most people either miss or deliberately ignore. Nick has a DD. Nick has crippling anxiety. These are not small things. They affect every part of his life. From how he communicates to how he processes stress to how he shows up to press conferences. And rather than taking the pharmaceutical route, which he openly didn't trust, Nick used marijuana as his way of keeping himself level. It wasn't degenerate behavior. It was self-medication from a guy who grew up in a system that never gave him any other options. The sport punished him for it repeatedly and mercilessly. And if you stack his suspensions against the steroid users who got lighter sentences, the word that comes to mind isn't justice. His run-in. Strikeforce was the purest version of Nick Diaz, the fighter that the world ever got to see. He became the welterweight champion. He put on performances that made hardened MMA veterans stop and say they'd never seen anything like it. His cardio built on triathlons, open water swims from Alcatraz, and a conditioning obsession that bordered on compulsive was genuinely inhuman. He wasn't gassing opponents so much as slowly erasing them. The longer the fight went, the more Nick improved and the more his opponents disintegrated. Nobody could keep up with him. Nobody. And then there was KJ. Nunes. The rivalry between Nick Diaz and KJ Nunes was one of the most genuinely nasty feuds MMA had seen in years. It wasn't a promotional beef manufactured for pay-per-view buys. These two actually despised each other. Their first fight ended in a controversial doctor stoppage that left Nick furious and KJ celebrating in a way that made everything worse. The words exchanged between both families in the aftermath were the kind that don't get forgotten. Nick called KJ's father a drunk. KJ's camp called Nick an unprofessional pot-smoking chump, and then they had to do it again. The rematch was a war. Nick fought with a broken hand. Nick fought with blood pouring into his eyes from the same cut KJ opened the first time, and Nick still went 5 brutal rounds and won. When they raised his hand, the only thing on his mind was Georges St. Pierre. It had been on his mind for years. The undisputed best welterweight in the world was in the UFC, and Nick wanted to prove he was better. That's all he ever wanted, the best fight he could possibly get. But before we get to GSP, there's something you need to know about Nick Diaz that almost never gets mentioned. Something that explains a lot about who he really is underneath all the bravado and the middle fingers and the Stockton slaps. There was a girl from high school. Her name was Stephanie Weiss. Nick has described her as the hottest girl in school, but more than that, she believed in him. Before his first professional fight, before anyone else saw what Nick could become, Stephanie saw it. She was college-bound, bright, full of potential, and she loved Nick Diaz in that way that first loves tend to burn the hottest, and leave the deepest marks. Nick fought for her in those early days. Got into confrontations with her ex-boyfriend and his football friends who thought her broke. Troubled kid from the wrong side of Stockton didn't deserve her. He was trying to hold on to something good in a life that didn't offer much of it. One night, Stephanie told Nick she loved him. They made plans. He went to check on some friends, said goodbye, and never saw her again. She walked onto a freeway and didn't come back. It was the third time she'd tried, and the last. When Nick got word, she was still out there. He laid down beside her, and he's carried that with him every single day since. After his hometown fight in Stockton, he dedicated the performance to her by name. And after every single fight, Nick ran 7 miles to her grave to promise her he was going to make it because he knew. She would have wanted to see it more than anyone. That's the man underneath the persona. That's what the cameras almost never caught. When the UFC opportunity finally came back around and GSP was on the table, felt like the universe was finally giving Nick Diaz what he was owed. A legitimate shot against the legitimately best welterweight on the planet, and then Nick missed a press conference. And then another one. And the UFC pulled him from the card entirely. The narrative that was written about those missed appearances was predictable, irresponsible, unprofessional, uncommitted. But the people closest to Nick told a different story. His anxiety was real. The performance of promotion, sitting across from a man he was mentally preparing to hurt, smiling for cameras and answering rehearsed questions, it genuinely broke something in him. He's talked about it himself. Being asked to fake civility, while simultaneously building the psychological intensity required to fight at the highest level, is a contradiction that Nick Diaz's brain simply couldn't reconcile. He wasn't blowing it off. He was falling apart quietly in ways the sport didn't care to understand. He eventually got the fight, and he lost. A lopsided decision to GSP that was hard to argue with on the scorecards. What came after the accusations about poisoned IVs, steroids? Missed weight reflected a man who simply could not process defeat on that stage, against that opponent after everything it took to get there. Nobody came out of the aftermath looking good. But if you understand the context of Nick Diaz's life, even the ugliest moments make a sad kind of sense. The Anderson-Silva fight was strange and inconclusive. Both men were operating somewhere below their ceiling. The result? A loss for Nick felt more like a footnote than a chapter. And then came the commission hearing that changed everything. 3 positive tests for marijuana in Nevada. The commission that collected those samples sent one to a non-WADO-credited lab, got an elevated result, and decided to use that specific result to justify the maximum possible punishment. 5 years. $165,000. And for context, Anderson-Silva, tested positive for actual performance-enhancing steroids in the same fight, received a shorter suspension. Nick Diaz, who smoked weed to manage his ADD and anxiety, was handed a 5-year suspension in his prime. He couldn't fight. He couldn't corner his brother. He became the first MMA fighter in history to sue the Nevada State Athletic Commission. He eventually got the suspension reduced to 18 months, but the years were already gone. The prime was already spent. And then us added more delays over missed whereabouts filings. By the time everything cleared, Nick Diaz had lost half a decade. While all of that was happening, Nate went out and submitted Conor McGregor in one of the most shocking upsets in UFC history. Nick watched from backstage. He couldn't be in the corner. He couldn't be there the way a big brother is supposed to be there. And yet, the moment Nate pulled off that rear naked choke, everything Nick had sacrificed, every street fight he steered his brother away from, every gym session, every example he set paid off in one submission. Nick always said he did it for Nate more than himself. That night proved it. When Nick finally came back, he came back against Robbie Lawler, the man who started the whole ride, the opponent from nearly 20 years before. He came back with 2 ruptured discs in his neck. He came back openly saying he didn't really want to be there, and that was written on his face from the opening bell. Lawler pressured him, hurt him, and stopped him in a fight that felt less like a comeback and more like a closing statement. After it ended, Lawler told him he hoped his life was going to get together. Nick, because he is exactly who he always was, said thank you. Here is what the record actually shows, separate from everything the sport wanted you to believe about Nick Diaz. First, WEC welterweight champion. First Strikeforce welterweight champion. Multiple successful title defenses in both promotions. Wins over Robbie Lawler, Frank Shamrock, KJ Noons, BJ Penn, Paul Daly, and Takanori Gomi. A fighting style so distinctive and so physically punishing that it influenced an entire generation of fighters who came after him. A cardio baseline that made world champions look like they were running out of gas in the second round. And none of that is what people remember first. They remember the middle fingers. They remember the press conference that collapsed the GSP fight. They remember the suspensions and the hearings and the Fifth Amendments. They built a villain out of a man who grew up without a father. Lost the girl he loved to a freeway, carried his little brother out of the streets, and quietly kept every promise he ever made to a grave 7 miles from home. Nick Diaz said he never had the opportunity to be a good role model. But think about what he actually modeled. Loyalty that didn't break under pressure. Authenticity that didn't bend to what the sport wanted him to be. A refusal to perform warmth he didn't feel or respect he didn't mean. A man who fought for a decade in a sport he never claimed to love, and still became one of the most technically brilliant welterweights it has ever produced. He wasn't the bad guy. He was just the realest guy in the room. And in a sport built on performance and persona, that was the one thing they couldn't forgive him for.